There we go. Good morning. This is the Reading Instruction Show, and I have a very, very special guest in my studio, Susan Vincent. Susan, who are you?
Well, I'm happy to be here. It's great to chat with you, Andy. I always love chatting literacy. So my name is Susan Vincent, and I am an experienced teacher, i.e. old, but I've been around early literacy for over 30 years. At 30 years, I stopped counting, so I'm not sure how far past that I am. But I've been a first grade classroom teacher, a reading specialist, a literacy coach, and I currently teach at the university level, teaching pre-service teachers. So that's who I am in a nutshell. I'm in Oxford, Ohio at Miami University, which is where I teach.
Wow, experience and knowledge. Well, Susan, if you could say anything to the science of reading advocates, what in the heck would you say?
Well, I'm glad you asked because I do love talking about this. And when I teach my pre-service teachers, the first day of class, I always like to give them my background so they know who's teaching them. And I've discovered that as I go through kind of my experience, it mirrors a lot of what's happening right now with the, if you want to call them reading wars or whatever. So if I could kind of go through my history and tell you, because in a nutshell, what I would like to say to teachers in the field, administrators making decisions about curriculum, legislators who are passing laws. I'm in Ohio. We have legislation being passed right now that not only dictates what you do, it dictates what you can't do. And some of what you can't do is very research-based and successful. So all of that, there are things that I would like to say that I think balanced literacy, or what I hate even using terms like that, because we all think of different things when we hear terms like that. But I think the practices that are commonly associated with balanced literacy have either been misunderstood by the science of reading movement, and I do think there are people that just misunderstand, or purposefully misrepresented to move the cause forward. And I do think there are people that purposefully misrepresent, maybe journalists perhaps, who might misrepresent when they know better. So my message would be, we really need to be clear about what it is we're moving against. And so I'll just tell you my background. I came to Miami University, which is where I teach here in Ohio, in the 1980s. And I was in a whole language program. They said flat out, we're whole language. That's what we do. I learned whole language. And then when I got my first job as a first grade teacher, it was in a whole language district. They said we're whole language. But even then, when it was as whole language as you can get, in my district, we had a phonics program that we taught every day, 20 minutes a day with my first graders. I was doing a phonics program where they learned to hear sounds and words. They learned the letter sounds. They learned to decode. I was doing it even back then. And in my undergraduate program, we read articles that talked about balance. We're not going to throw kids in a pile of books and hope they learn to read. We have to teach them skills as well. So I feel like even back then, we were doing a balanced job. So then after I was a first grade teacher, I became a reading recovery teacher. My district had a plan that every first grade and kindergarten teacher in the district would be trained. So I was trained in reading recovery in the mid to late 90s and did that for 7 years. And then I became a teacher leader, which meant I went around and trained the reading recovery teachers. But even then, I look back, and when I was first a reading recovery teacher, I inherited a set of books, and they were very patterned. So this is issue number one, the issue of what books do we put in front of emergent readers to read. And the science of reading movement would say, balanced literacy uses patterned books where kids don't have to look at the print. It's just about memorizing, looking at the picture and memorizing the words, and then saying it. They don't actually learn to interact with the print. And I think the thing is, I think both sides have valid points, and that's how we get on this swing. And I think the valid point was that was happening. I saw it happen. I had the same books with all the patterns that went on way too long. But my point is, and it was around 1998, somewhere in there, all the reading recovery teachers were gathered together and we were told, you can't be using pattern text after, and what they said was after kids have left to right directionality. I would go so far as to say after they have one-to-one matching, because pattern text is a crutch to help children be able to say, oh, one word out of my mouth, I point to one word on the page. So in 1998, we were told to get rid of the patterned books as soon as they had, that print concept of going left to right. So to me, that's a very false argument. That's one of their main arguments, is it's all about memorizing, words, and we're memorizing patterns. So then I go on and I became a literacy coach, and I got involved. I don't know, do you subscribe to Spell Talk by any chance?
No, I do not.
Or do you know what that is?
I do not.
Okay, well, you should subscribe. So I was a reading specialist during the time that the dyslexia movement came about, which I feel like was legitimate. I feel like there were a lot of kids who had learning disabilities who were not taught with the appropriate instruction. I think that was legitimate. And at that time, the special education teachers in our district asked us to join this listserv. And so it's kind of an old-fashioned listserv where you get emails. The discussion happens through emails. And it's a science of reading movement. Louisa Moats is on it. All the big names are on it, plus thousands and thousands and thousands of special ed teachers, speech therapists, Stephen Dykstra, all that crew is on this listserv. And I joined very naively, thinking I would interact with these people and we'd have these great conversations. And as soon as I started interacting, I learned very quickly they were not interested in my point of view. But I didn't leave. I stayed on. I've been on probably 10 years now, because I learned from them what their point of view is, what their beefs are, what they think has gone wrong. And I think there are kernels of truth that things were happening that needed to be addressed, but it just went way too far, way too far. So I suggest, I believe in learning from everybody. Yep. Let's hear what people have to say. That's how we become better. So I would suggest you join.
Okay, I will look at that. I agree with you. It's important to hear what people are thinking. Even if they yell at you, it strengthens your own point of view. Anyway, great story. Keep going. This is good.
Okay. So I guess my next point would be, one of the other things balanced literacy is accused of, besides the pattern text, so we could have a discussion about what kind of text we put in front of children. But they also, you see it over and over again, 3Qing. The approach is 3Qing. And I just kind of want to set the record straight. I don't, even people who are balanced literacy people and reading recovery professionals now start using the term 3Qing. And we never used that term. That was never a thing. It wasn't an approach. But now, because of all the media calling it 3Qing, now we call it 3Qing. So, and I refuse to call it 3Qing because it's not a thing. But the idea was, when children read, when anybody reads, they are reading printed language.
Yep.
It's language. And so inherent in printed language is the print. Also inherent in language is meaning. Language is meaningful. That's what it's for. And also inherent are structural things like the way English works. And that's the three things: meaning, visual, which is the print, the phonics, and language structure.
Let's dig down. That is such an important part. 3Qing is not an approach. It's not a strategy. It's a recognition that brain uses interactive systems to recognize words during reading. I'm going to say it again. It is not a method. It's not an approach. It's not a strategy. It's an understanding.
Yeah.
Good
and
stuff.
it's inherent. It's inherent in the reading. You can't take it away. So Ohio has passed legislation outlawing 3Qing. How do you outlaw what's inherent in printed language.
Hey, you kids, don't use all of your brain. Just use the letter sounds.
Yes. Yes.
It's the law.
So that's problematic. Mari Clay, who, she started Reading Recovery and brought it to the United States. And I trained, so she brought it first to Ohio State University. That's where I got my training in Reading Recovery and as a teacher leader. I had Gay Soup and Al, the whole thing. But again, and I think this was around 2000-ish, I can't remember when her publications changed. And she said flat out, I'm not using the term Q anymore because it's so, people are misunderstanding it and misinterpreting it. We're done with queuing, she didn't even say queuing. We're done with talking about cues. We're going to talk about sources of information.
Good.
And so that's been 23 years now that people in our profession stopped using the term Q, but this movement went back in time and looked at old publications, old things that were written, and thought, here's a good point we can make. And that's how this came about, which just drives me crazy.
Well, let's dig down on that. Pulling up terms and misusing them, misapplying. Even things, Ken Goodman has become a swear word to some people.
Yes.
He's been accused of called it guessing at words.
Yes.
Why? That just drives me crazy too. They pull a little thing and they misunderstand a term and they misuse a term. And Mari Clay and Ken Goodman are swear words to some.
Yes.
I would posit they actually never read an article by these people.
No. And so you mentioned the word guessing.
Yes.
And I'd kind of like to talk about that as well, because when they give the example of guessing, the typical argument that they say, or the example is, those balanced literacy people teach children to look at the first letter and the picture and then guess, because that is a prompt and a strategy that you might teach a kid, but I kind of want to explain it. It works in the exact opposite way of what they're thinking it does. It teaches children not to guess. Because when we teach emergent readers, we know that children who don't know anything about print concepts, little kids, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and they open a picture book, they make it up, as they should. That's a normal part of literacy growth. And we always called it inventing. They would invent the story, and that's a normal, stage you go through before you learn how to use the print. In order to stop that and to teach children that, we don't just make it up. We have to use the printed symbols. The easiest symbol to use is the first letter in a word. It's the easiest to see because space comes before it. It's the easiest thing to recognize in your mouth, that first part. So in order to stop guessing, the first step could be, you said puppy, but look at the first letter. It's a D. Let's think about how it can't be puppy, which you guessed. So that whole guessing thing, I think our purposes were the exact opposite of what they think. And then the other strategy, and I don't know if this was a Lucy Calkins or maybe it was in Classrooms That Work. I don't know where it came from, but it was the cover the word. Do you know this strategy? Like you might have a chart the kids are reading, and one of the words you cover with a Post-it note, and then you just reveal letter by letter. And they're saying you're teaching them to guess. You're covering the word and then saying, what do you think it is? Again, I've used that strategy and I use it for the guessers because I need to teach them you can't guess. Let me show you. If you're saying, like, if the text is there is my house and they're saying home, I'll cover it and say, okay, you think it's home. Let's check. Could it start like this? Could there be an O next? Oh, but now look, what would you see if it was home? You'd see an M. Let's look at what it actually is. And now let's talk about, the OU, like it's like an out. So you know what to say there, and there's an S. So what could it be? So for me, that cover the word was not about guessing. It was about stopping guessing.
and it develops metacognition. Does it make sense? That's the
Yes.
purpose of reading.
Yes. And so kind of to get back to that spell group talk, and I think they've evolved too. When I first was getting emails from them, they were against any kind of meaning making until like third grade. Like, no, there can't be any meaning in the text because children's minds might go away from the decoding, and that would get in the way of orthographic mapping. And all that. And I think they've evolved from that. They didn't like any sight words, even though OG, and I'm trained in OG. So I'm not somebody who's not trained in, like, I'm trained in OG, I'm trained in foundations because I wanted to learn about everything so I can speak from a point of knowledge.
Mhm.
I think they've moved away from that. They didn't want sight words because it got in the way of orthographic mapping. Like if you memorize a word, then you haven't orthographically mapped it, and then that's going to mess up your whole system of reading. And so I think they've moved away.
Mapping? How would you define orthographic mapping?
To me, it's that when you have a lot of experience seeing a printed word and you've matched the sounds coming out of your mouth with the printed symbols in whatever form it is, letter by letter, it could be chunk by chunk, however, but you've matched the sounds coming out of your mouth with the print that you're seeing, and your brain recognizes that word and knows that word and knows the meaning of it. And you've done that enough that it becomes a sight word, like you just know it, then it's been orthographically mapped. I mean, that's, to me, that's what that is. And I don't know that, I'm not an expert in orthographic mapping, but what would you add to that or take away?
I would just comment, the brain is naturally evolved to recognize patterns. It's a pattern recognition thing. But when we hear the word cat, we don't associate it with short A words. We associate it with cat things, with meaning. That's how our brain organizes words, not by letters, but by concepts. So this idea that as we're reading, our brain is acting like a computer, matching letter sounds, no, it's focusing on concepts, on meaning. Anyway, interrupted you.
No. And I think that's right. And, I always wonder, back when they were saying there should be no sight words and you shouldn't expose kids to any words that they can't decode. That's how the book should work. I always wondered what they thought about children who know their own name. They come to school and that's a sight word, and most of them are not, phonically regular. How do they explain that? Or do they argue like, oh, you shouldn't teach your child their name because it...
Dolch, Zeno, Fry, these most frequent words, and there's research to show that if you're not, these most frequent words frees up short-term memory to focus on meaning, so you're not sounding out the, in, of. And you leave kindergarten with 40 to 50 of these, and it's one of those what I call I thinkisms. I think that's right. So it's based on an I thinkism that we shouldn't have sight words. Anyway.
I like that. That.
Sounds like you have lived through the history. Reading First Initiative, you went through that.
That was interesting to me because for Reading First, it was funding that controlled people.
Yes. Yep.
And my district was a higher socioeconomic district, and we didn't need the funding, and we didn't take the funding, and we didn't do Reading First. So I continued to teach in this very balanced place. Our kids did great. But at that point, I was a teacher leader where I went around to other districts and trained teachers in other districts. So I was in a lot of different places that were Reading First. And what I found ended up matching the research that came out in 2008 that it didn't work. But I found that the richer districts, and they tended to be white, continued to teach in a balanced way with very engaging little books for children, and they were reaching high levels. The districts that I were in that took Reading First tended to be lower socioeconomic, tended to have more children of color, tended to be like, you would walk in and they were doing worksheets and skills, and they had very nice handwriting. I would always say that they did a great job on handwriting, but it was very skills oriented, but it didn't translate into becoming a reader who can comprehend text. So in 2008, when the research came out that it didn't make a difference that we had done all this in reading first, I have to say I was not surprised at all. But then what was heartbreaking to me was after that research came out, that's when the dyslexia movement started. And then my district followed the dyslexia movement. And at that point, we adopted dibbles. We started going that way after it had already been shown. And then teaching changes, because assessment drives how teachers are going to instruct, because sometimes their paycheck relies on it, their evaluations rely on it. And so when my district started we used Ames Web instead of Dibbles, and there was the whole, how many nonsense words can you read in 1 minute? Yep. So then you'd walk in classrooms and there's teachers teaching nonsense words because they need their kids to score high. And you have teachers training kids, when you read, just go as fast as you can. If you don't know a word, just blow by it. If you're not understanding it, don't go back and reread, just keep going, because you've got to get a lot of words per minute. So because we adopted that skill-based assessment and we valued it so highly, teaching changed as well.
And I always ask, do we want students to be able to sound out words or to be literate? And to be literate is to use reading and writing for authentic purposes. Yes. You go ahead and you sound out your silly words in isolation. I want my students to be literate.
And that speaks to what books we put in their hands. So to me, there are, leveled books have also been they're against the law in Ohio now. Leveled books are against the law. And decodable books are what everyone has to use. But again, those are just labels. There are leveled books that have the same level of decodability as some of the decodable books. And so what I just really wish we could get to the point of is having teachers who have enough professional knowledge to choose books that fit the needs of the students in front of them. So yes, they have a chance to practice their decoding skills, but they also, from the earliest days, have a chance to maintain meaning as they're decoding, because that's a tricky thing to do two things at once.
Yep.
And if we have teachers who can look at books, no matter what the label is, and decide this fits my purpose, this doesn't, instead of legislating and then publishers slap labels on,
yep.
It just drives me crazy.
When the whole language movement came, people were just slapping the whole language movement on stuff to sell product.
Yes. And now you see it, you see publishers doing that. You see consultants who are now, I'm going to teach you phonics and science of reading. A year ago, I was balanced literacy, but now I'm this. And I understand, that's their living. That's how they have to make a living. With laws passed, you won't get hired in Ohio if you're not teaching that. So I understand people doing this. But I just think that's why it's so important that legislators and decision makers, administrators learn the field and not just go by what, journalists or a movement tell them.
Or at least ask the experts. I want to ask you about journalists and maybe Emily Hanford in just a minute, but the educational industrial complex is what I call it, should not exist to make money off our children. They are bloodsuckers feeding off the hopes and dreams of parents, and we have public education to prevent that. So the for-profits have wormed their way in, and it just is not right. People need to make a living, absolutely. But you need to make millions and billions of dollars off our children? That's a rhetorical question, sorry.
Well, I agree with you completely. It breaks my heart that it's happening here in Ohio, where they're mandating programs and outlawing other programs and not allowing teachers to
Yes.
decide what's right for their own students, not allowing teachers to be professionals like
Hello.
we allow other professions to be professionals. I think you're absolutely right.
I always thought, what if there was a science of plumbing and they mandated certain plumbing? I had a toilet that backed up once and they're not teaching plumbing the right way. We need to have a science of plumbing.
Yes.
That's an analogy.
Yes.
All right, speak to Emily Hanford if you would.
And I will right up front tell you, I've not listened to her. I won't. And I know I need to. And I have people say, you have to. She upsets me so much.
Yep.
And back in the early days when she had first put her stuff out and was becoming a name, and she was on Twitter all the time and she would interact with you. That's, so I've interacted with her through these Twitter conversations. And I just find her so disingenuous. And I know, for instance, back in the early days, she came to Ohio State to tour Reading Recovery and sit in on lessons and learn from the people at Ohio State. And I know she seemed like she was going to be balanced and taking it all in and going to, represent what she saw there, and then did the opposite.
Yep.
So after I knew that happened, I think my blood pressure would go too high. It wouldn't be good for my health, but I still say, I think I need to, because she's changed everything. Like, she's been the driving force behind so much of this and getting awards for her great work. And I know journalists don't have to be experts always in what they're reporting on, but if they're reporting the facts, and she's not, she takes an opinion and pushes that. So that's how I feel it. I don't feel like it is journalism. To me, that's not journalism.
Subjectivity presented in a very objective way. Just because you don't use personal pronouns does not mean you're being objective in your reporting. I listened to her original podcast, APM, years ago. And of course, I immediately got on American Public Media and I said, you got this wrong. And how much time do you think I was given? They said, oh, no, she asked some people. It was balanced. And it's not. And I, like you, I refuse to put myself through listening to her. Now, she is invited to speak at the Illinois Reading Council conference, and I'm presenting there as well. And it's like asking a faith healer to present at a medical convention.
Yes. Yes.
Why, in heaven's name, would you ask a charlatan to speak and give her that platform?
When you know that she has a personal monetary interest in making a big name for herself, and she found this movement that she could attach herself to and make that name for herself, and now she's famous. So I feel like she accomplished what she was really out to accomplish, as opposed to being out to help the field of literacy grow and help more children. I don't see it that way.
I hope 10 years from now, they'll look back and call this the Hanford era, because I want her to take ownership for what she is doing to literacy. Take ownership for how literacy is going to go downhill. It already is. Take ownership for how many good teachers leave the classroom because of the external mandates. Take ownership of that, Emily.
Yeah. In Ohio, for example, I know North Carolina mandated letters training.
Yes.
Talk about making billions of dollars.
Yes.
Louisa Moats. But in Ohio, they didn't mandate letters training, but they mandated training in science of reading for all teachers. So, for example, my district that I used to teach for 25 years has mandated all their teachers to take letters training. And on their own time. It's very intense. I mean, it's long. It's hours and hours and hours. And on their own time, they're not provided time during the day, they have to take letters training. And I know that's happening all over the country. So, they talk about Lucy Calkins making money. Good grief, who's making money now?
Good grief. Well, Louisa Moats, who I think is a charlatan as well. And the reason is I read her white paper on the website, and Lexia Learning and Cambium are there to make lots and lots of money. But the way she misuses research, misinterprets research, I don't know which is more frightening, that she doesn't know the difference or that she knows the difference and does it anyway. She makes statements such as saying teachers don't know how to teach reading. And she cites a research study that really essentially she gave a poll on what she thought teachers should know. And based on that survey, then she made the conclusion that all teachers don't know how to teach reading. That's the type of research, in quotations, that she uses to make her case. And people just see the sites and they go, oh, research. Well, Louisa Moats must know what she's talking about. When she either doesn't, and that's a scary proposition, or she does and she's making it up anyway.
And I think there's people, I think both of those things are true with the people in this movement. I've interacted with people that I know believe this, like they just misunderstand. And then I know there are people that I know understand and misrepresent it. So I think both things are going on.
It's scary.
It is scary. It's very scary.
People who should know better and do this anyway. Well,
and then from that research that teachers don't know how, I personally have interacted online on Twitter with people who are so condescending to me.
Yes.
And it's in this very kind way, like, you know what? It's not your fault that you don't know how to teach children to read. You were never taught the right things. And, no one in college ever taught you, and you're ignorant, but you can't help it. And we're here to help you now. Which I find so insulting to say, and people say it who have never taught anybody to read.
Well, let's pick up on that point. People sometimes get down on me because I use funny voices, and I'm sometimes a little attacking in my podcast. But for God's sakes, what have they been doing for the last 20 years? How we try to use research and reason, and they do what you just said. So somebody has to go out there and be the mean, crabby person.
Well, I feel like there's probably a lot of us who are not buying into the movement.
Yep.
But don't have a big voice.
Yep.
And teachers who feel like they can't have a big voice. In my district where I taught, you can't really have a big voice because this is what's happening. And it's not even just the district, it's the state. So they feel like they'll be in trouble if they do anything different or speak out. But I feel like there's a lot of us who feel this way.
Yes.
And it's common sense, really, but based on science. And I feel like if more of us come together and speak up and educate people, it's not about spouting opinions, it's about educating people. I feel like we could come to a reasonable place and help more children instead
That's why we have the International Literacy Educators Coalition. It's a group of educators from around the world that are feeling frustrated and recognize that teachers are afraid to speak out because they can't.
Yes.
And I would be the same way if I had a family to feed.
Yes.
Shut up and do what I'm told.
Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned the international part of that, because for years now, I hang out on Twitter just because that's where I was able to connect with a lot of different educators that I couldn't geographically, hang out with.
Yep.
And I've learned so much from these networks that I've formed on Twitter. But one of the networks is with teachers from Australia and UK
Yep.
who are going through the same thing. And in UK, they're farther along than we are. Like they've already had the mandated programs. They're, that's already happened. And just on a personal level, talking to these teachers and just the craziness, inspectors come to see what page on the phonics book they're on. It's just nuts. And it hasn't worked. That's what the latest research showed out of UK. It didn't work. And they've done it for maybe a decade now. I think, why can't we learn? We already did reading first and we didn't learn from that. And now UK's just done it. And apparently we're not learning from that. So I'm glad you mentioned the international part of it, because it's not just a US problem, and I'm Canada too.
I feel like I've made friends all over the world, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, UK. And it is refreshing. I'm not crazy. Other people think this way too.
Yes.
Well, I've already made my podcast for 10 years from now. And the title of that is, I Told You So.
I love it. I love it.
Oh, that would actually be a fun podcast to do.
It really would. And, when I came to Miami University, I got my undergrad here, but I also got my master's degree here. And I had to write a thesis. This was back in the early 90s. And I chose to write on the history of reading instruction in the US.
Yes.
And I thought at the time, this is so crazy how we do this. It's so nuts. I'm glad I'm not going to have to live through that. I really thought that. I'm glad, we've learned from this. We've learned from history. I won't have to live through this. And then my whole career, now I look back and I think, my whole career witnessed it continuing.
It was back to the basics in the 80s. And it was reading first in the early 2000s, in the aughts. And now it's come back with more of a vengeance with the science of reading.
More of a vengeance is right, like more of a vengeance.
Because the for-profits are behind it pushing. And how do you argue when you have a $1 million voice and I'm just a little bald guy with a small little podcast?
Yes. And, now we have legislation in many states that, is cementing it. It cements this until we get new legislators who, don't do this. But I'm mentioning this not because I wrote a book, but just to say, so a few years back, a co-author, a teacher from the district where I worked, and I wrote a book about teaching emergent readers in small groups. And it was really, the purpose was to say, it's important what books you put in front, and they shouldn't be patterned, and here's how you can help emergent readers use text. But it's illegal now in my state. My book, like nobody in my state would be able to buy my book because I talk about meaning structure and visual. We talk about leveled books, like everything we talk about is illegal now, and that children should be thinking about meaning from the earliest stages. So even that, like even books now are against the law, which just blows my mind.
Right. I never thought we would be at this place. Never, ever in this country, I thought we would be at this top-down authoritative place where small groups are dictating to the masses. If you want to end with, let's end with one big idea. One big idea, Susan, that you'd like the world to know.
One big idea is, and this is what I would say, like to my pre-service teachers, please read all the research. And please look carefully at the history and what certain approaches did. Like there's research that shows the results of different approaches. Please read all of it and be knowledgeable about all of it so that we can move forward in a smarter way than we've done in the past. That would be what I would say.
Excellent. That is a good last word, as Lawrence O'Donnell would say. All right. Thank you, Susan, for being a wonderful guest.
I enjoyed chatting with you, as always. I always learn from you. So thank you for your work. Much appreciated.
All right.